Thank you, Damien, for that very kind introduction. So I'm going to talk, ladies and gentlemen, a little bit about what's going on in the HMO world, what has changed in the last year, and what we all need to be doing about it. Now, normally I sort of run around the room and talk a lot, but apparently there's a TV camera here today, so I'm going to be gripped by a lectern. I'm not allowed to wander around in my normal manic fashion. So if I wander too far, I'll get rudely signed to get back to it. So, HMOs, and I'm told if I do presentations where it's CPD qualifying, we have to start off with a little bit of an agenda. And I'm told on this agenda I'm going to talk about understanding past and present, what's happened, what's going to go on, how do we value HMOs? Does it actually matter whether we value them as an ordinary house or as an HMO? And indeed, what are the impacts on lenders and investors and indeed brokers? And how's this all going to pan out? Now, I gave this presentation only 6 days ago in Coventry to another group of brokers, and it would appear that I've been quoted in the press on something I said towards the end about ambulance chasers and HMO tenants going after their landlords to get their money back. I was quoted as saying it was solicitors who were doing it. If I use the word solicitor, there's normally an expletive before it and an expletive after it. I'm pretty damn sure I said ambulance chasers, claims management companies, and certainly they wouldn't take as little as 10% of the kickback, they'd take between 20 and 40%. And I then was challenged on Twitter, and I do know how to access Twitter. I was then challenged to prove it. I've tacked the proof on at the end of this presentation, so you can see a sample letter of what your clients are getting from these ambulance chasers, not solicitors. So I'm going to go at a fair good old pace so we get the punch point at the end, and there are a couple of saucy photographs on the way through of what a really low quality HMO looks like. So let's understand where we were back in the day. And back in the day was any day prior to the 30th of September 2018. HMOs were defined as 5 or more people from separate households in a building that was 3 stories or more high. And that basically meant that most of the property population was out of the picture on HMOs whether you liked it or not. And then of course it comes down to tenant sharing for common facilities, and was it within an Article 4 direction area amongst the statutory authorities. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want to become an expert on them, there are 353 of the buggers to pin down, and they all have different rules and different interpretations of mandatory regulation. And of course here we are in London, but if you've got clients in Wales, everything in Wales that is rented out, whether it's an HMO, a house, a bungalow, a flat, or a holiday cottage, which they cremate on a Friday night, you have to apply for Rent Smart Wales as well. And of course, in the old days, an HMO licence was deemed to be valid for a maximum of 5 years. And the crucial thing is maximum, because they can withdraw it if they think you've transgressed as a landlord. So, my sales director, Phil Richards, some of you will know, he likes to quote this, and he's been quoting for so many years, but actually it takes on a relevance in everything else that's going on between Bojo, Jezza, Arlene, Frau Merkel, and the rest of them. Actions of people, and especially governments, always have effects which are unanticipated or unintended. And of course I am going to restrict myself to HMOs, because of course I'm not going to a party political broadcast rant. Shoot a whole lot of them. Anyway, moving on swiftly. So what changed? So the 1st of October last year, we knew we used to have 60,000 HMOs in the country. How did we know? Because you go around 353 councils and you add up the number of properties on their register. But with the introduction of the no limit on the 3-storey rule, i.e. an ordinary 2-storey house or indeed a flat or a bungalow could become an HMO, the government went, we think there's a few more properties. And the only people that have come up with a suggestion of that is the Residential Landlords Association, and we'll come to that in a moment, and you'll see the scope of the problem and also the scope of the opportunity. And of course then they defined minimum room sizes. A single room size at 6.52 square metres, a double room must be at least 10.22 square metres, and then of course some councils set other rules beyond that. So if you want to take just Nottingham City Council, where they've got 2 universities and 2 teaching hospitals, wow, fun, isn't it? Any permutation of 1 rooms with cooking facilities, without cooking facilities, ensuite bathrooms without them, that is just Nottingham Council, and trust me, you'd have to be really dull if you wanted to learn this all off by heart. But this is what you're going to have to be doing when you're talking to your landlords. First thing, you tell me you've got an HO, are we sure it is one, and where the heck is it? Let's move on. So, the National Landlords Association, which has now merged with the RLA, they think because no one actually knows, 177,000 extra properties. So we've gone from 60,000 to nearly 250,000 properties that have become HMOs overnight. And your landlords and landladies haven't done a thing. They didn't blink, they didn't sleep. But on the 1st of October last year, some of their properties will have become HMOs and they may not even be aware of it. And of course, you may have been letting a property, or your clients may have been letting a property in a student town where they had 6 students stacked up in it, because they could. But it's now an HMO. It might no longer be a 6-bedroom HMO, it might be a 5-bedroom HMO. And I've got a shocking valuation report at the back of this that you're going to love about the minimum room sizes. But there's teeth in this. This isn't just the government putting legislation out there. They can go after landlords and they can fine them up to £30,000 for non-compliance. But here's the real rub. A landlord who hasn't got a licence cannot evict his tenants if they say you haven't got a licence, and it can go back to the 1st of October of last year and they can reclaim all of their rent back, and the landlord or the landlady cannot touch them even if they're not looking after the property during the whole period of the debate of the rent. And I'll show you an example in a moment. So this is really serious stuff for landlords, and you will have some clients who to this day are still not yet aware that they've got an HMO. And it's really quite important that they discover it before their tenants do and start getting involved with the ambulance chasers. So I was out on the road in about May time. I got sent down to Reading, Bristol and Cardiff. So I got my own back of my sales director. I sent him to Leeds for the day instead. And as I went past those cities, I had my team phone in to the local licensing officers and say, how's this all landing in your world? What's going on? So the nice people in Reading say, well, we've got 1,000 HMOs, we're a city, we've got a couple of hospitals, we've got a university here. We think we'll get about another 3,000 more. So an extra 3-to-1 ratio. Sounds in line with what the RLA and the NLA were predicting. And we're saying, we're not going to change our licence fees. It's about 770 quid for a 5-bedroom HMO, but we've got a surge in applications. We're 12 weeks behind. Get down to Bristol, and Bristol were watching a High Court case that went all the way to the European Union, which of course could be history shortly, where a landlord had challenged the transparency of the fees. So they'd just piled up their 500 odd applications in the back corner of their office, hadn't even acknowledged them, hadn't even processed them. But when the ruling came through about transparency of fees and the processing of it, the landlord should never have prodded, because it then gave them the justification to put a basic administration fee on for 468 quid. Wouldn't we all love it if we could charge 468 quid for processing of mortgages, ladies and gentlemen, regardless of the outcome, and then another 952 quid for actually granting the licence at the end of the whole process. And then Leeds, and this has had us roaring with laughter, Leeds is known as the HMO capital of the universe, not just the United Kingdom, of the universe. And so we spoke to Leeds, so they said we've got 2,700 and we think we might have 700 more. So we rang up the chief surveyor of Allied Surveyors, a lovely chap called Peter Folds, who used to be number 2 surveyor at Paragon, and he said, that's the best joke I've heard in my lifetime. He said if they've got 2,700, they've probably got another 6,000. So if anyone's got clients in Leeds, you may need to do some homework with them. But indeed, they weren't that far behind. They're a big department. They've already got nearly 3,000 landlords or 3,000 properties on the books. So they're at 6 to 8 weeks turnaround, and they're only charging £675. But trust me, you know, these licensing officers do have an annual conference where they get together, look at tariffs, and what will they do? Dash to the bottom or climb to the top? They're going to go to the top. So it's going to get more and more expensive for landlords as time goes on. But here's the problem. With those lag times, are the landlords actually going to get a licence back to have a conversation with their tenant, or indeed with you or with me as a lender? Because these days I do sport a hat as a lender, which is amusing to most of my colleagues, but I do pretend to be a lender. So, if we're talking about valuing an HMO, why does it matter that we approach it differently to some, others approach it differently to us? And it's our understanding, what is the relevance on this HMO? Is it an area where there's some form of Article 4 direction that the local authority doesn't want more HMOs, and therefore there's a constricted supply, therefore it must have a value? Or could you or I'll pick on Sam, my colleague here, Sam could go and buy another house in the same street and make it an HMO tomorrow, therefore there's no additional value to it because anyone could do it with any other property in the street. And indeed, you need to know, when your landlord tells you he's got an HMO and he did it with a property club and he spent all this money, it's now worth £1 million, you go, okay, let's start with the basics. Where is it? What have you done? Does it need planning permission? Have you got a licence? And is it in an Article 4 area? So we take the investment approach. We follow the excellent example set for many years by Paragon, because of course they've been doing this longer than even I've been alive. And there's 2 or 3 other lenders, I think Landbay and Foundation adopt the same approach as we do. We put an investment valuation on. And if the investment valuation, because it's an HMO in a constricted area, gives you a higher number, we go for that. If it's an ordinary house, and we had a valuation only last week in Harrow, which is relevant to where we are here in the Barbican, the valuer went through all his mathematics and came up with a figure of 850,000 as an investment. They said, do you know what, but as a house, it's a lovely Edwardian house, you could flog it tomorrow morning to a family for 930. Your valuation, Mr. Whittaker, is £930,000. So sometimes it doesn't work out, but when it does work out, you'd expect the investment valuation to give you a better number. If you're a lender that doesn't do a lot of HMOs, or indeed perhaps doesn't even know you're funding an HMO, and you put an ordinary valuer in, they'll do a comparative valuation. If they can find HMOs in the area, they'll reference it. If not, they are obliged by their PI policy just to value it as an ordinary dwelling, because how else can they value it? They're not trained as commercial valuers, they're not allowed to do a discounted cash flow analysis, and their PI policy would walk away from them tomorrow morning if they did. So there are 2 schools of thoughts here, and it's quite important that when you're talking to your customer, you know what it is that you've got. And it's really important that you speak to the BDMs from your lenders and say, this is what I think I've got. How does that fit into your willingness to lend, and how will you view it? And because this is all far too complicated for a simple person like me, we have a piece of software in our office. You give me the house number, the full postcode, we feed it in, we get a property lock, we can tell you what it has, what it needs to have, what it ought to have, and what it flipping well ain't got. And that is gospel. So we go into the planning registers of the councils, we go into the planning authorities, and we tie it all up. And more importantly, the map that shows up in front of my underwriters shows the Article 4 direction areas that says, this is an area where if it's got the right planning, hold on to it because it has value. If it's in any other street outside an Article 4 area, it's your choice to make it an HMO, but you might not get a better valuation for it. So, how as lenders can we assist? I guess we start right at the beginning, that when you come to us, and I know most of the other lenders now do it, if you tell us it's an HMO, rather than waiting for the solicitors to play with it at the final part of the process, we go and see what planning it has. So the house that you, ladies and gentlemen, live in, or I live in, is C3. Small HMOs are C4, but you're not obliged to go from C3 to C4, because you have what's called permitted development rights to move from C3 to C4, unless the council has put in an Article 4 direction, i.e. they don't want more of them. And this is the rub. If you think that the planning authority on the 4th floor of Southwark Tower speak with the licensing authority and the licensing officer on floor 3 of Southwark Tower, you are mistaken. So the licensing officer will hand out a license to anyone whose room sizes fit the law and has door closures. He or she is not bothered one iota about the necessary planning permission. And the planning officer doesn't care what the licensing officer has done downstairs, so unless someone comes to him or her with a planning application, they're not going to do anything about it either. So they work for the same council, they get paid by the same council, but they speak even less often than the credit team and the sales team and the lender. It's the way of life. So when a customer says to you, but I've got an HMO license, you say, yeah, good start, really helpful, now let's talk about it. And I know if you speak to my sales team internally, or I'm sure if you, I see Karen's here from VDA, speak to their sales team, they'll go and look for you and say, do you know what, it's in an Article 4 area, it hasn't got C4, we think you may have a problem unless you can prove certificate of lawful use. But here's the rub, as your landlords go through this miasma of problems, what have they done? They've faithfully trotted down to the local licensing officer and applied for the license. But in the case of someone like Bristol, where they piled them up for 6 months, all 500 of them, have they discharged their responsibility? And as a lender, am I going to say, well, you ain't got a license, matey, I ain't going to lend? And this is where the practical view of lenders comes into it. We just say to you, get an acknowledgement letter from Bristol, and they've given you a reference number, D1456789/Z, and we'll say, you've discharged your obligation to apply for a licence. We're not going to put a time span on it because you can't control it, it's out here in the swamp. But by the time my value has been round it, I know whether I've got an HMO that's fit for purpose, and I'm sure Karen from Vida would say the same. You know, we rely on our own judgment in the back of it, but you do not want to get caught in a mess where a lender asks or insists you procure something that's beyond your control. And this Article 4 direction area really does matter. We're nowhere near Worcester here, but Worcester put in an Article 4 direction area. They gave no notice, and even people who'd got a licence but hadn't got C4 planning, they ruled them out. Now, I'm sure someone's going to challenge it in the High Courts. Normally a council, you'd think, would give you 6 or 9 months' notice to get it right, but there are instances of councils giving 2 years' notice, right down to Worcester, who went through no discussion period and just announced it, and people with HMOs in Worcester are out. When the licence runs out, they've got to revert it to ordinary dwellings. Bit of a shame if they bought it off their mate as a running HMO. So, here's the other funny part of it, that when your customer walks down to, let's say, Lambeth, and he fills in the 36-page form, somewhere on about page 8 it says, who's your existing lender? And you faithfully fill in that let's take a really big lender who's lent on this market forever. Let's take BM Solutions, who probably knowingly don't lend on HMOs, and off goes a nice letter to BM Solutions back office saying, Mr. Smith is now running an HMO. It doesn't say that Mr. Smith has done nothing wrong, he hasn't changed it, Mr. Smith is now an HMO landlord. Well, thank the Lord that BM Solutions has Phil Rickards running it, because he just says, poof, we'll just add it to 11% of HMOs we don't officially know about already. But the reality is, a lender could say to a customer, you're in breach. I don't lend on HMOs, but your customer has done nothing. They've just complied with the law that says, as of the 1st of October last year, it's become an HMO. So it's quite important that as lenders, if your customers do get a funny letter from a lender who really isn't very comfortable with HMOs, that you say, okay, just hold on people, the customer hasn't done a darn thing here, let's see if it can stay where it is, but clearly that lender's not going to do a further advance or a fancy remortgage or capital raise, because they're going to say, at that point, probably you should take it elsewhere. But there's ways that lenders need to behave to make sure this works out. And of course, if we've gone from 60,000 odd up to 230, 240,000 properties, whether the firms that I use and people like Paragon use are up for it is debatable in terms of capacity. All the valuation firms, again, have to get their valuation teams up to speed and on the bus to deal with this, whichever investment approach they take, either full investment or comparative valuation techniques. Now, you expect me as a lender to say more complicated means more paperwork. It's just me putting a cry in for my service standard that you must allow me a few extra days. But when a valuer goes into an HMO, it's not like going to a house where you just have to ask Mr. and Mrs. Smith permission to inspect the house as the sole tenant on the AST. If you've got 6 students on 6 separate ASTs in an HMO, under law, the landlord cannot say, I give permission for you to inspect those rooms. Not legal. All 6 people have to allow access, and that can put delays into the valuation process. Well, at least that's my excuse, and I'm going to stick with it. Okay, so what happens to the landlord? So now they've discovered they've delightfully got an HMO, but nothing's changed. There will be costs. They will have to put automatic door closers on. They will have to improve their kitchens, and I'll show you some interesting kitchens at the back end of the presentation. And indeed, it may well result in them going from 6 bedrooms down to 5 bedrooms, because that last bedroom may not fit the new mandatory sizes. And of course, landlords become identifiable on the council's website as an owner of HMO property. So, moving on very swiftly, and here's the first boys, some students in Leeds, clearly somewhat well-heeled students, so they managed to run to a suit and a tie. I don't think my kids at university had ran to a suit and a tie, but they took their landlord to court. And actually they got their landlord under the old legislation because he was deemed to be an unfit landlord by the council and shouldn't have been running an HMO in the first place, but they got £15,000 back. And this is the sort of typical money. This isn't PPI at £3,200. This is large sums of money. And the longer the period goes on, it doesn't mean it's limited to a year. It always goes back to 1st of October 2018. The reference point is always the 1st of October 2018, and there's no statute of limitations on this. So, there's the story, you know, he was in the wrong and they got him, and then of course Leeds went after him for not having it licensed, and they probably fined him as well. But the reality is, this is what one or two landlords do. So when they're told that they've got to up their property, as someone, and it was Coventry, someone did say to me, well, you can collect the post as it comes through the door and have a good read in the morning. But on what basis, ladies and gentlemen, is that going to sit well with my underwriters? And Sam's one of my underwriters here today. I don't think it's one of Sam's files, but, you know, there are things that we can turn a blind eye to. That wasn't one of them, nor indeed is this one, ladies and gentlemen. So the other particular thing I will put in that I am still just about 6 foot tall. This would have to be let to a house full of undersized pygmies under 5 foot tall, let alone the fact there's a very elegant Kazi in the middle of the kitchen. But these are some of the things we see as people desperately try to comply with the law about putting extra facilities into their properties. But I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, none of you have any customers that do anything like this. I am going to move on quickly because time will go against me. So here is a valuation report. I'm not sure how well you can see it at the back here. Sorry, this is the London Borough of Lambeth licence, where in May of this year, I can tell you they granted a 6-person, 6-bedroom licence to our potential borrower. And so that arrived on our file before the valuer went in. We thought, fine, this is an Edwardian house, 6 decent-sized bedrooms. Oh, fine, we'll see what happens when the valuer goes in. And the licensing officer did go out and inspect. We know that because the client said, well, he didn't have a problem with it. Let's now go to the valuation report. You will see that some of the bedrooms, I'm not sure how well I can read it from here, some of the bedrooms are above 10 or 12 metres, but by the time you get down to bedrooms 5 and 6, one is 4 and a bit metres and one is 2.02 square metres. The irony is that 3 of the bedrooms are so humongously large, you could run them as doubles and you could still have a 6-bedroom HMO. But the fact the licensing officer had gone out and said, 6 rooms, 6 bedrooms, 6 people, tick, 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 made a mockery of the difference of reality of the licence and what was on the ground. But then here came the real rub. It was an SW16 in Tooting. There's no Article 4 direction down there, so he could have bought the house next door for a whole load less money. And why the heck was he paying a premium from HMO when he could have bought the house next door and put door closers on 4 bedrooms? But these are the sorts of things that we all enjoy untangling. So let me come to the subject of the ambulance chasers. How do I know this case is true? Because it came to the partner of a colleague in the office who owns a flat in West Kensington. You say, an HMO in West Kensington, that's a bit unlikely, but it came to her tenants, who are a husband and wife, and they shared the letter with her. So, justice for tenants. It's got a nice catchy ring to it, and we believe that your landlord should have a licence. And if your landlord hasn't got a licence, we'll go and jolly well sort it out for you. We'll get you your money back, and we'll have a percentage of the ante. How do we know they're working? Because when we get to the back end of it, they cite some examples. You can get 12 months rent back. Incorrect. You can get your rent back to the 1st of October 2018. No statute of limitations. Oops. A couple of examples on the right-hand side there. Sorry there. 14,000 on one, 16,000 on another, 15,000 on another. So, you know, these to your landlords, ladies and gentlemen, would be a massive hole in their pockets, and the tenants actually wouldn't get all that money. The ambulance chaser here, called Justice for Tenants, would probably take 25 to 30% of the ante for doing this. So what they're doing is they're looking at properties that they can see are let, or they found one flat in the block where they've had some success, so then blind post into every door in the block of flats and see where it takes them to. Because if they were in the habit of getting 25% of a £3,500 PPI claim, 25% of £15,000 certainly justifies them doing a lot more speculative work. So you'll have your customers starting to get these things, and they'll probably, their tenants will go after them, albeit with the wrong prompting from JFT and others. But you know, PPI has now officially come to an end. These guys are looking for their next big opportunity, and I suspect this is one of them. So in summary, the impact of these regulations have been the need for councils to increase their staffing to handle this increased level of applications. But to be fair to councils, and it's not something I readily say, they were given 6 months' notice of this by central government. They've never been allowed to resource in advance of an event in a financial year. So if we take the borough of Kingston upon Hull, who we've spoken to, they had 3 licensing holders, gentleman at the back there from Kingston upon Hull. Is it Royal Kingston upon Hull? Oh, it's not, okay. They had 3 licensing officers. One was on long-term sick, another lady had gone on maternity leave, and the head man actually picked up the phone to us. They're not staffed up for this. Now that they can see the money coming in, they can recruit, but then they've got to train, and we all know what training is like in our own businesses. This isn't something that's going to be changed overnight. And of course, for your landlords, you've got to say to them, now, you didn't start out wanting to have an HMO, and you probably don't know you've got one, but just talk me through what actually this property is. It's in a university town, you've got students in it. This might now be an HMO. And indeed, what are the sizes of your bedrooms? And I had a pretty robust debate with a broker the other day, because those that know me know I'm quite robust. And he said, yeah, but the top bedroom is massive. Ladies and gentlemen, you do appreciate anything below 1.5 metres high isn't legal. You can only measure the footplate at 1.5 metre height throughout the bedroom. And of course, there are financial implications of not having a licence. They could get you for a £30,000 fine, as well as your tenants getting their money back, as well as you having to rectify the property. So it's all good fun. But it's up to us as lenders, and I'm sure Karen from Vida will agree. Karen, I keep on picking on you, but you're in the room, aren't you, darling? We're here to try and help you. So you reach out to the BDMs of your lenders and say, this is what my customers told me that they've got. Shall we work out what we think that they've got? And then should we decide mutually how we can transact it? Because landlords have been pilloried by the government over the last 5 years. This is just another aspect of it, and it's not up to us to inadvertently make the situation worse than it already is for them. I will finish on one final example. Rogue landlord fined £40,000 over dangerous and unlicensed HMO. As it's now a fact of law, and I'm not breaching GDPR, a subject that's really close to my heart, Julie Churchill of Newport Lincoln was responsible for unlicensed HMO which also failed to comply with a number of safety standards. The property was missing fire doors, had no working fire alarm on the ground floor, and 3 bedroom drawers which could be locked externally by a padlock. Fantastic. Lock your tenants in until they pay their rent. She had been warned, she had had measures placed on her for the council. It would have cost her £6,000 to put it right. They took her for £40,000 of fines. And here's the daft thing. She had 7 people in a 4-bedroom house. She was only putting £1,480 a month rent out of it. It wasn't as if she was coining the money in. And of course, she now appears on the inappropriate landlord register. She won't be allowed to have any more HMOs in that borough. And the central government register, if they ever get it off the ground, she'll appear on that and can't own an HMO anywhere in the country. So this is Lincoln City Council, because I'm told that Lincoln is a city, £40,000 on a landlord who got it wrong for £1,480 a month of rent, and she could have got it all sorted out for £6,000. Ladies and gentlemen, if you think that councils aren't on top of this as a money-making opportunity, both at the point of licensing and collecting fines, think again. Do reach out to your landlords, discover what they've got, and then speak to your lenders and say, how do I help my landlords and landladies get through this fun? I'm out of time. I got time.